It is one of the worst disasters in Canadian history, certainly in the mining industry. In October of 1958, at a coal mine in Springhill, Nova Scotia, 75 men died. Many were trapped for several days. Today, in conversation with his new book, Ken Cuthbertson, on Blood on the Coal. Welcome to the program, Ken.
Oh, thank you for having me, Jamie. I appreciate it.
Well, let's start here. Let's talk about Springhill, Nova Scotia. This is a one-industry town in 1958, and it's already gone through hardship. But what is Springhill like at that time?
Springhill at that time is a thriving little as you said, a one-industry town. It was about 7,000 people, and virtually every job in the community and virtually every person in the community had connections to the mine. So without the mine, the town would not have existed. And the issue there was that there were not a lot of good jobs for people in Nova Scotia back at that time. As today, it's economically not what a lot of other areas in Canada are. And so the people who worked at the mine felt that they were lucky. They made about $75 a week to work at the mine, which was a living wage in those days. It was about the average industrial wage in Canada. And the thing was that they worked hard for that money, and it was mining, as you know, is a very, very dangerous occupation. And it was even more dangerous in Springhill than it was in most other places. And it had to do with a number of factors, but the peculiarities of the geography there and the topography and the way the earth is structured beneath Springhill. It was very unstable. And the result was that they had in the, I think, 40 prior years to 1956, they had 500 little mini earthquakes, which had shaken the mine. And 300 and some odd miners had died in these events. And in on two instances, in 1893, they had a big disaster that killed about 120, actually, more than the 58 disaster. They had another bump in 56, which wasn't directly related to an earthquake, but a mini bump. But it was an accident in the mine, and it killed 30 some odd miners. So people knew that there was a bad situation in Springhill. And the deeper they went in the mine, the more dangerous the mine was. And the unfortunate thing was that in 1958, the Canadian economy and the North American economy was changing. And coal, which had been really the main fuel to be used in the railway industry and in a lot of electrical generation and industrial applications, didn't have the same market. So the price for coal was falling in Springhill, and the future of the town didn't look good. But the issue was, could you close the mine? Even though it was dangerous, even though it was starting to lose money, could you close the mine? And the answer was no. If you closed it, it would kill the town. And to me, that is one of the really interesting things that I didn't know before I got into my research for the book. I thought it was simply going to be a story about a mine disaster and an interesting human interest story. But the more I got into it, and I began to see draw some parallels between really the situation that we're facing as a society and a world today, and what was going on at Springhill in 58 is uncanny, because I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions, and I won't belabor this, but I'll mention it here, and we go forward, is that in 58, single industry mining town, totally dependent on coal, which is a fossil fuel, the quintessential fossil fuel, easy to mine in some ways, cheap, and it can be used in a wide variety of applications. Still being used today. Fossil fuels are an issue for us, and we're hearing the same arguments against phasing out of fossil fuels today that they were using in 58 and hearing in 58. Can't phase out the fossil fuels because it's going to kill jobs. And that was the essence of the situation in Springhill in 58.
And you mentioned the previous disasters, 1-2 years earlier. That was in a different mine. This was mine number 2, where
Yes.
where this accident happened, a bump, as you say, really an earthquake. But there was a difference in how this happened. The ground shook, but it also heaved up. I'll let you explain that to our viewers.
Yeah, in essence, when you hear about a mine disaster, you tend to think, gee, the miners are down there, they're digging, and something happens, there's an explosion because of coal dust, or there's some sort of an industrial accident, and the mine caves in on them. But in effect, what happened in Springhill was that, as I said, the ground was very unstable, and you had a long history of these, what I called many earthquakes. Bumps is what the miners called them. And they were used to actually to dealing with these. There were originally 5 mines in Spring Hill from the time that they began mining in the 1870s up until the 1950s. By 1958, there was only the 1 mine left, the number 2 mine, and it was very unstable with these bumps, which were mini earthquakes, and the ground, in effect, would lift up, would heave upwards. I don't, you know, when you see news reports about earthquakes, and you'll see quite often the roads have jumped up, and there have been landslides and things because the earth has heaved, and there have been openings in the earth. This is, in fact, what happened underneath the mine on the evening of October 23rd, 1958. They had, at about 7 o'clock, they had a mini bump. And the miners, whenever they had a mini bump, would stop because union regulations were that, and the agreement with the company, they'd stop for 20 minutes until the air was clear. But you can imagine you go down there at 7 o'clock in the evening, you're working and there's this bump, the air is filled with coal dust and you're shaken. You sit down for 20 minutes and everything seems okay, so you go back to work. That's exactly what they did on this particular night. And at 8:06, the earth heaved again, and this time it was a big bump, the big bump that they've all been dreading for so many years. And the results were catastrophic.
And some of the men that were down in this mine were killed instantly. Others survived. I want to talk about that in just a moment. But just again, to provide some context, this was a deep mine. We're not talking a couple hundred feet here. We're talking really deep into the ground.
Yeah, in effect, it's pretty close to a mile deep. When you read my book, if you do read my book, or if you hear about what happened, they talk about the mine disaster happening at 13,400 feet, 13,600 feet, 13,800 feet. It's not straight down. What it is if you're on the surface, you begin to go down and you go on a slope in order to go down into the mine. Those little cars that carried the miners down and carried the coal up went at a 30-degree angle. So from the point you were at the surface, down, when you went down the slope to where you actually were doing the mining was 13,400 feet. So it sounds like it's really deep. It's just a mere mile or so underground though. So, you know, whether you're a couple hundred feet underground, if you're a mile underground, what's the difference? I mean, but there, basically, if an accident happens, there's not much way out for the men.
And so some of these men were killed instantly, crushed by the rock, and you know, when this bump occurred and the ground heaved up. There were 2 pockets of men who survived, and in case they became known as the miracle miners.
Yes.
You know, because some were almost a week, others were more than a week, as long as they were down there. Just help us explain that story and the conditions that they had to face over that time to survive.
Yeah, Jamie, there were 125 men working on the shift, on the evening shift. And when the bump happened, some of them were able to get out. There were about, I think, 75 or so who scrambled up, actually more than 75, because 75 died instantly, because the earth moved, heaved them up, threw them against the roof of the mine, threw all their equipment up, and basically they were crushed like, much like you would squash a bug, really, if you were hitting it with a fly swatter. It just got like squashed. So that was 75 who died. So there were, of the 100 other miners who were down there, 20 were trapped. And as you said, in 2 groups. There was one small group of about 12. There was a group of about 8. And really it was kind of the luck of the draw where you were working in the mine. And the individuals who were working in particular areas on the slope of the mine were the ones who survived. You know, they went down there. Their shift started at 3 o'clock. So around 6 o'clock, as was customary, they had their dinner. So they sat down, opened out the lunch boxes, and you might wonder why it was 3 hours after they started that they had their dinner. But they did that because they wanted to feel like they were at home. The miners wanted to feel that they were still up on the surface, eating with their families. You know, the typical dinner time was 6 o'clock, so they would sit down and have their meal at 6. 7 o'clock, that's when the mini bump happens, and then 8:06, the big one happens. So your meal is, you've eaten all your food that you've had down there, you've got a bottle of water, and you've probably drank most of it. But when the bump happens, suddenly you're in the dark. You don't know where your lunchbox is, even if it's near you. Your water bottle is gone, and basically you're out of luck because you have the light on your head, on the headlamp, which in those days, the batteries would run for about 8 hours. So these chaps were down there in the dark. They'd been thrown up against the roof. They wake up and they don't know which way is up. They don't know which way is down. And if they're lucky, their light is working. If they're not lucky, their light is gone. So they're in total darkness, a mile underground, no food, no water. And some of them are badly injured.
And some obviously tried to find their way out while they had perhaps light, trying to claw their way through coal that had landed in front of them and blocked passageways. But it was an exercise in futility. And it had to be very, very difficult on those men to keep their spirits alive, and some tension, I would think, as well.
Oh, for sure. Jamie, if you've never been down the mine, and I haven't been down in that type of coal mine, I've been down in the mine, but not that particular one, obviously, because it's sealed up now. But if you were walking along, think of it as a hallway, the area where they mined. They were about 8 feet wide, okay, and about 10 feet high. And when the bump happened and the floor rose up to the ceiling, in many cases, there was no way to go through at all. In other cases, there was a space maybe a foot square. And that's, if you were able to crawl through there, well, okay, you might have a chance at getting out. But even if you crawl through farther along the passageway, it was probably blocked. So basically, you were trapped. There was no way out, no way out.
What a horrific experience for those men, some of whom who survived.
They were buried alive, basically. They were buried alive.
Exactly, and obviously the oxygen and the concerns around just being able to breathe down. They were fortunate in some ways that there still was enough oxygen for them to survive.
Well, Jamie, one of the big things in any coal mine disaster is the poisonous gases.
Yes.
The poisonous gases that come out of the rotting vegetation, which is in effect coal. That's one of the biggest dangers because it's high in methane and there are other gases in there that are certainly can kill you. So that was the big fear for the miners who survived. They didn't know if the air would be fit to breathe or not because the ventilation system in the mine was no longer working properly.
Now, when you did the research, almost all of the miners who had survived that incident had passed away. There was, however, one survivor. He was an elderly man at that point, Harold Bryan. He has since passed on. But that gave you an eyewitness account of what that experience was like. Tell me about Mr. Bryan.
It did. Oh, well, actually, let me tell you about Harold Bryan. But the way I approached writing this book was whenever you hear about a disaster and you hear that a large number of people have died, it doesn't have a great deal of impact on you because unless you know someone, you can't relate to exactly what happened. You hear the story and you think that was awful. But the instant you start to hear about an individual or you know somebody, it becomes more personalized. And Harold Bryan was one of the individuals that I wanted to write about, primarily because he was the last of all the miners who was still living, the last of them, which is amazing when you think about it. So he was one person I wrote about. I wrote about another fellow named Morris Ruddock, who was one of the black miners. And they called him the singing miner because he loved to sing. His family, he had 13 kids, and he taught all his kids to play musical instruments, to sing. They were in choirs and sang in groups around town. I wrote about another fellow named Tommy Tabor, who was a local. All these people were local. Tommy Tabor loved to play baseball, and that's what he really wanted to do in life, but he had to work in the mine. And he came from a family of, I think there were 10 of them. 2 of his brothers had already been killed in mining accidents. So I wrote about him. I wrote about Harold Burden as well, Arnold Burden, who was one of the town doctors who worked with Anne Murray's father. Anne Murray, the singer, her father was one of the doctors in town, Carson Murray. So anyway, back to Harold Bryan, was 26 years old, a Spring Hill native, a salt of the earth guy. And I'm really fortunate to have met him and became his friend. I have a picture of him in the book. He and I kind of hit it off, and I kept in touch with him. But he was really an amazing man, and to go through what he went through, and he wasn't bitter about any of it, and he still wasn't afraid to go back in the mine. He said he could have gone back in the mine the day after the accident and gone back to work because it just didn't faze him. And that I'm aghast or puzzled and amazed that anybody could say that or do that. But Harold was an amazing guy. like all miners, he suffered from black lung, which is breathing too much coal dust. Had a bad heart and whatnot. And back in August, he called me one day and said that the pain was just too much. He couldn't bear it anymore, and that he was going to go for a medically assisted death. And in fact, that's what he did the next day. So Harold is gone, but he was an amazing man, had a terrific memory, a steel trap mind, and answered any question. And some of my questions must have seemed pretty foolish to him, but he would answer them day or night, and sometimes he would call me back and to explain further what he'd been telling me. And so I owe him a great debt of gratitude. The story wouldn't have been written without him.
Yeah, he was certainly a very interesting person in your book. And we're going to continue our conversation with Ken Cuthbertson, the author of Blood on the Coal, the story of the 1958 Spring Hill, Nova Scotia mining disaster. We'll be right back after this message. One of the incredible stories is the rescue effort and the fact we had these miracle survivors, over several days after the bump had occurred.
Yeah, that's a really amazing thing to me. Again, a thing that I can barely relate to is the courage of these people in Spring Hill. No sooner did the mine disaster happen than within about 15 minutes, 20 minutes afterwards, the local mine manager, a guy named George Calder, had organized a rescue expedition where they went down into the mine looking for anyone that they could, who might be still alive. The miners had a credo, much like, say, the U.S. Marines or something, where they leave no person behind, dead or alive. They'll always go back to look for those who are injured, those who are surviving, and those who are dead, and they won't quit until they find every last person. And that's, in fact, what they did here. They went down into the mine within 15, 20 minutes. But, there was a lot of hope initially because of the condition of the mine. When the rescuers went down and saw the conditions, knew that there was poison gas down there, they didn't think anyone was going to get out. And in fact, that's the Dominion Steel and Coal Company, which ran the mine. They held press conferences and they said, don't have too much hope. So it was really, as you said, it was a miracle. It was a miracle that they found anyone alive. And they found the initial group, on October 30th. So you think they were down there without food or water in the darkness, many of them badly injured, for about 6.5, 7 days. And that in itself is amazing. They found a second group, on November 3rd. So what's that, that's about nine and a half, 10 days. That was a group of 8 initially. But one of the poor fellows who was down there was trapped. What happened was part of the mine collapsed on his arm. So he was basically pinned with his arm crushed. And he survived for about 7, almost 8 days in that condition before he died. So he wasn't one of the ones they rescued. And the rescuers who were down there were finding dead bodies, and because of the temperature in the mine, bodies were decomposing. So it was a grim job, and it was dangerous. Yet they did it. And I was going to mention this to you. The media interest was intense, particularly from the CBC, which dispatched television crews. Some of the early pioneering work in broadcasting from actual disasters in the field was pioneered by CBC. And the television broadcasts were watched not only in Canada, but across the United States and even in Europe, where they picked up the coverage. So Canada was in the forefront, but for a bad reason.
And this is in the heyday of newspapers, where newspapers are pumping out stories about major disasters like this. So you've got this influence of the larger city newspapers from Halifax and bigger centers that are coming in. The locals aren't particularly pleased that they're there.
No, not at all. You're quite right. There were something like 140 journalists who descended on this little town of Spring Hill. A lot of them, they came from New York, the New York Times. They came from Boston. There was even a couple of reporters from London, England. There were American television reporters. There were people from Toronto, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, and the Telegram all sent teams of reporters and photographers. And then they competed to see who could write the most spectacular stories. And of course, the locals resented it. I met one man who, actually the last fellow who was there reporting, who's still alive, who told me that he came from Halifax. He was sitting he was 18 years old, a rookie reporter, really a gopher who was there to do Joe jobs for the senior reporters on the Halifax paper, sitting on a park bench, and some teenage girls came along. And of course, being 18 years old, he started to flirt with them a little bit. And they asked him why he was in town, and he mentioned that he worked for the newspaper. They got up and left. One of them sort of spat on the ground next to his foot and said, "We don't want to talk to you. Leave." And that was basically the attitude of the people in Springhill.
Prince Philip happened to be in Canada when this disaster occurred.
Yes.
And made an impromptu visit to visit in hospital some of the survivors and actually signed autographs, which is a faux pas for the monarchy. I'll let you
Yes.
pick up the story there.
Right. Prince Philip apparently had been touring, I don't know if he was in the States, but he was certainly touring Canada in Ottawa, and he was about to fly home when the Queen heard about the disaster in Springhill. If you've watched that series, The Crown, you may remember that the Queen had a bit of an issue with a disaster. I think it was Aberfan or Aberfoyle in Wales, where there was a coal mine disaster, and I think it was a landslide or something that buried the town. And people wanted her to go to Wales, and she didn't. And ever after, she felt badly about that. So she, in this case, when something happened bad in a mine in Canada, she asked Philip to stop and to give his condolences and to cheer the people. So Philip did. He, to his credit, on the way home, he diverted his plane. They landed near Spring Hill. He wanted to go down the mine, but he couldn't, obviously, because the rescuers told him it was simply too dangerous. So he went to the hospital, and he went to the hospital, and the first person he saw was Harold Bryan, my friend, who was there in the bed closest to the door. And Philip said to him, "Well, what are you doing?" He said, "Well, I was down the mine and I was rescued." And Philip looked at him and said, "Well, you look fine." And Harold said, "Well, thank you." And that was the extent of the conversation. And afterwards, I asked Harold about it, and I said, "Did he say anything further?" "No, he just passed on." And talked to other people. And as you correctly mentioned, Philip, there were no reporters around, none from the British papers. So Philip, who was a bit of his own man, let's put it that way, agreed to sign autographs and shake people's hands, and he was a regular guy. And so it was a tremendous event in Spring Hill, and earned him a lot of brownie points and learned a lot of goodwill for the monarchy.
And for the survivors, certainly there was an outpouring of concern from Canadians, and not only Canadians, from around the world. We think of GoFundMe sites now, but there was a significant amount of money raised for the spouses and children of those miners who were killed, and also for the survivors. And Ed Sullivan, who was the biggest name you can probably think of in entertainment in those days, with the evolution of television, invited some of the miners to come to New York City to be part of his program.
He did. I mentioned that the Toronto Telegram was Toronto Telegram was in Spring Hill. They sent a team of people. Sorry, my phone just rang. They arranged to have two of the miners and Dr. Arnold Burden on the show, on Ed Sullivan's Really Big Shoe. And Ed Sullivan, to his credit, introduced the miners, and then he spoke to his audience, which was vast in those days, and said that there were, I think, 156 children who would be without a father now, and there was this fund, and he urged Americans to ante up and to support the fund, and they did. Well over $1 million came in, which was good money in those days. And Sullivan himself, backstage after the show, met the miners and their family members who'd come along, and he reached into his pocket and he pulled out a check for $10,000 on his own personal account. So Ed Sullivan was a pretty good guy in that regard, and the help that he gave for the Miners Relief Fund really made a difference.
The state of Alabama also tried to capitalize, I would say, on this situation by offering a free vacation, free trip to the survivors. The story is somewhat sad. It is sad in that Maurice Ruddock, who you had talked about, the singing miner, because he was black and Alabama was a very, very segregated state at that time, he was put into different quarters than the white miners.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to move you a little bit to the east. Jamie, your geography is probably not much better than mine in the southern U.S., but it was Georgia, actually. And the governor was a guy named Marvin Griffin. And Marvin Griffin was a staunch segregationist, but Georgia was trying to build its tourism industry. So he got the bright idea, well, we'll invite these miners down because they've been on the Ed Sullivan show, and a lot of people are interested in them. So he invited them down for a free vacation. But then he found out that this is when the 12 had been rescued. Then the 7 were rescued, and they were going to come too. But then Griffin found out, well, God, there's a black man. What are we going to do? And he wanted to cancel the trip and said, well, you're not coming if a black man is coming along. He could come maybe if it's going to be a segregated trip. And Morris Ruddock, to his credit, said, sure, I don't care. We'll go along. I don't want to cheat my other miners, my friends, out of a trip, because most of them had never been outside Canada in their lives. So they got this wonderful, all expense paid trip to Georgia. And Morris Ruddock took 2 of his kids and his wife, and they stayed in segregated quarters. And the local black community in the town there looked after them, fed them, held a dance for them, took up a collection for them. And afterwards, Ruddock told the media, and this was broadcast as well in Life magazine and whatnot, that he had had a better time than the whites, and he did, which kind of rubbed the governor's nose in it.
We're almost out of time. You mentioned Anne Murray, who wrote the foreword for your book, probably Spring
Yes.
Hill's most famous resident. But what were her recollections of this disaster and its impact? Certainly her father was one of the doctors there.
Yeah, in the local town. Anne Murray, in those days, was still a teenager, just learning to sing. And in fact, she was good friends with Morris Ruddock's daughters, and sometimes would go over to their house. And Anne Murray told me that Morris Ruddock was the one who taught her to sing gospel and played a big role in the way she developed her singing style. When the disaster happened, she had friends who, although her father was a miner, she had friends from school and in the neighborhood whose parents' fathers were down in the mines. So Anne Murray joined the group that went over to the mine each and every day, sat there waiting for news on what was happening down in the mine, who was alive and who was dead. And she told me it was an ordeal, and I can believe it was, although she didn't have the same emotional trauma or the same emotional engagement, but you know, these were her friends, and she certainly knew some of the men who were down there, and some of them didn't come up, and she's never forgotten that. To her credit, you know, she was eager and more than willing to write the foreword for me, and I really appreciate that. She's a wonderful person, and if you go to Spring Hill today, there's not much there, but on the main street, there's an Anne Murray Museum, which is a really nice facility if you ever go there. And it's astounding when you go through it to see and to remember her musical career, because she knew everybody anyone who was in the music industry, performed with the biggest names that you could imagine. And yet she's still a down-home lady, has retired now, but has gone back to Nova Scotia to live, and still goes back to Spring Hill and still has friends there. Everybody seems to know her, and she knows everybody.
Ken, it's an absolutely outstanding book. You've written many, but I think this is one of your best. Blood on the Coal, which is the true story of the Great Springhill Mine Disaster. Thanks for coming on the program.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you again for having me. Appreciate it.
In Conversation with Ken Cuthbertson.